Hello and welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. As always, Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I talk about your thoughts. Specifically, the idea that you shouldn't believe everything you think. We discuss rumination, overthinking, the difference between productive and unproductive thinking, fear and courage, mindfulness, gratitude, the effects that psychedelics have on psychological flexibility, ancient wisdom from the yoga and stoicism traditions, and much more. A few announcements for you before we get into the episode. If you're looking for professional training pursuant to becoming a psychedelic-assisted practitioner, you can check out the courses we offer here at Numinus. Click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/training. You can use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that we do here at Numinus. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support our show, the best way to do that is to leave us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share the episode with someone you think might benefit from the content. Without further ado, here's today's episode on your thoughts. So Reid, to begin this episode, I have a quote to share with you. We've literally never done that, but... No, this one comes from...
I don't want to hear it.
No, we just ruined our flow. What am I supposed to do if I can't...
Start over.
I can't, mind the wisdom of others.
Let me guess.
So this is from Hamlet.
Okay.
There is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
How apropos.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good one. It's a classic. Although I think Shakespeare could have said it better.
Oh my God. How dare you?
You know, if you look at the CBT concept of thinking, like your thoughts about something lead to how you feel about something, and there are multiple interpretations of your thought. Like someone walks by you and doesn't say hello, and you could have a thought. It starts with that thought of, oh, they walked by, they didn't say hello. Mm-hmm. But it's the meaning we ascribe to it that really matters. And I think his quote may not fully capture that, but it's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the thinking about thinking, perhaps.
Because in that example, you could then ascribe meaning, oh, they may just be having an internal moment, a bad day, or not have noticed me, even though I clearly did. And then you could kind of continue on with this stance of equanimity, or you could overthink the hell out of that and be like, oh, they don't like me. What did I do?
Yeah, I think, when we were talking about this episode, certainly we've talked a lot in previous episodes about thoughts, about cognition and how that can lead to suffering. We just thought it might be useful to focus on sort of the broader concept of reification of thoughts, right? You have millions of thoughts, probably millions of thoughts every day. The mind is sort of a thought generating engine, right?
You're not going to stop that.
Right. And people often, if they get into meditation or mindfulness-based meditation, they often mistakenly assume or believe that it's about clearing your mind of thoughts. Like, I can only find peace if I can simply not think.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps that's possible. I've never been able to do that myself. For me, what's more helpful is to learn to watch those thoughts, right? And not, as you're saying, not immediately ascribe meaning to a thought just because it erupted into my consciousness.
Yeah, there's some phenomenon of overthinking and spinning into ruminating, especially when it's of a negative nature. And I like what you're saying, because I like to remind people as well, it's about making space, making a clearing, not eradicating thought, which we need and we're wired to have all the time. But yeah, we can exert some a little bit of control on the direction of our thoughts and therefore feelings and everything else.
Yeah. And we have a lot of aphorisms, ancient and modern wisdom too, that sort of focus on this point, like you are not your thoughts, or don't believe everything you think.
Yeah.
Is one that we hear often.
And I find those useful, like especially, well, both of those, like especially the first one of I am not my thoughts. Like, because it is easy in certain times of intense rumination to get caught up in it, and it can turn into catastrophizing even. But sometimes that little flip is what gets you from over-identifying with a thought into that space of de-identifying or separating yourself from being that thought so you can actually observe it.
Yeah. I think it's one of the pillars, cornerstones of good mental hygiene. A good mental health is first, I guess, believing what we're saying, that you actually aren't your thoughts, that, your mind is this broad sky through which the thoughts can pass like clouds, or just sort of occur and emerge. And it's, like you said, by getting stuck on them, and then which results in things like rumination, that it tends to lead to unnecessary suffering.
Yeah. And it can be a little bit confusing at first to try and find the difference between like resisting and exerting that little bit of control, searching for the right terms here. But, resistance is to be avoided, but they're, in that stance of equanimity, or where you separate yourself from the thought and remember that more expansive place behind it, that comes with it an acceptance that I think makes the big difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe we talk a little bit about acceptance and what that looks like, because I can imagine having a thought that could, lead to some self-loathing. Like, let's say I make a mistake, or I fail at some kind of particular endeavor that I wanted to succeed at, and I immediately have some thoughts like, you suck, or you weren't good enough.
It's all my fault.
Yeah.
So never get it right.
If we're thinking about accepting, maybe we accept the fact that we are having these thoughts. Like, if we're just sort of look at the thoughts in a mindful way without judgment, it's maybe even okay that you're having these thoughts that are particularly negative. Not okay in the sense that you want to reify them, like we said, or believe them, but it's okay that they are there, because you can get down on yourself for getting down on yourself, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes this happens to the quote unquote A students that are in therapy. Let's say they're in cognitive behavioral therapy, and they're like, dang it, I'm still falling prey to these cognitive distortions. I should have control over this. And those thoughts in and of themselves are something to be aware of and accept.
A trap for sure. So what do you do? What does one do?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I liked what you said earlier about creating space. And so that's another way of thinking about what we're talking about right now, at least, is first acknowledging, okay, I'm having the thought. It's okay that I'm having the thought. There's a difference between me being stupid and me having the thought that I am stupid. Mm-hmm. So that helps create a little bit of space, right? And then with space, it gives you a chance to react. And that puts you in a position of volition, of agency, of choice. I don't have to ruminate. I don't have to believe this particular thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Like we were talking about, I think maybe even last episode, about Byron Katie's the work. Any method of self-inquiry, if you will, to turn it around or challenge that. Try and first catch it, notice it with that non-judgment, but then slip into that broader perspective.
Right. Yeah, and we've referenced a lot of different modalities on the show before of dealing with thoughts like this. You mentioned Byron Katie's The Work. We've talked about cognitive behavioral therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy, I think, is a pretty good modality too. We've talked a lot about IFS. We can dive deep in any one of these, but one of the things I like about ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, is it acknowledges the mind as it is, like we were saying, just sort of this thought-generating engine. And Steve Hayes, who created ACT, has come up with a lot of fun ways, I think they're fun, of dealing with those thoughts. He'll he'll have a negative thought and then sing it to himself, or imagine it, or even say it out loud in the voice of his favorite cartoon character, just to create some of that distance.
Yeah.
Right? It starts to sound ridiculous. I suck starts to sound ridiculous when it's in the voice of Donald Duck or whatever.
That sounds like a good pattern interrupter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're talking about. That's why it's recommended so often to do meditation practices. We sometimes forget what we're doing and why, but part of it is training our mind, or training those things that you're talking about, like to start to practice that pattern of observing, of doing it non-judgmentally, of challenging those false beliefs. And it's part of mindfulness, is that attentional training, the equanimity, that in addition to just tuning into your senses, like your breath.
Mm-hmm. I like the way you're describing it as a pattern, and that something like mindfulness is a way to step out of the pattern, or at least make the pattern conscious. A lot of these patterns tend to be a little subconscious. So we're bringing the pattern into awareness and recognizing it for what it is. And then, like I said before, we're introducing some choice after awareness.
Yeah. I'm thinking, I went to this concert, it's just a couple of weeks ago, I think. It was kind of a wild concert, but the guy's name is Enzo. It's electronic, and he's known for Alan Watts remixes. He made one in particular called Overthinker that I was just playing before you walked in when the beat dropped. But that song, it's really what made him famous. I think he used to tour with LS Dream, I think. But that song opens with Alan Watts saying, "A person who thinks all the time has nothing to do but think," and starts to lose touch with reality. And then he clarifies that, I'm not saying thinking is bad, but I'm just pointing that out because I think using mindfulness as a tool to know if we're overthinking is one way out of that place where our mind's wandering too far into the future and the past. Like a little bit of future tripping, although we wouldn't call it future tripping if it's just a little bit of anticipation of the future, can be quite adaptive, and we're wired to do that, predict and anticipate. But it gets really squishy and more delicate and a personal thing to find that balance of what is, of kind of coming back to the here and now when you find yourself spinning into other places of overthinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about overthinking a lot. Many of you could probably relate to the idea of overthinking, but I wonder, Reid, what do we mean when we say overthink? Because it's hard not to think. We just talked about how it's probably impossible to stop your thoughts. Maybe there are some yogis that can do it.
Yeah. Oh, and I'd love to go down that yoga rabbit hole, but I'll wait on that. But because I think it's a really good question of what are we talking about when we talk about overthinking versus just thinking, just having a thought, and what is its connection to neurosis or neuroticism, right? And I'll put a pin in that as well. But overthinking, I think, just encompasses those things we've started to touch on, like overanalyzing, where you're just going deeper and deeper on a thing to the point of distress, procrastination, excess, or there's the rumination where you're stuck in a negative thought over and over. And then there's that rehashing the past, like, oh no, I did this, I'm so bad, or the future tripping, like everything's going to go wrong, I can't show up at that thing.
Yeah, those are good examples. I think about one of the differences between, say, rumination and something that I call, chain reaction thinking. Is rumination, like you said, is stuck on a particular thought or a particular event, and you're just sort of mulling it over. Why did it happen this way? Could it have happened differently?
Usually the past.
Yeah, you see this in people with a lot of regret, remorse, or people with trauma that they're sort of stuck on. And then chain reaction thinking is more about the future. It's like the what if thing. Well, like, what if this happens? And if that happens, what if this happens? And you can imagine how that would be really anxiety provoking, but it also can lead to one of the things you mentioned, that's procrastination, where people who are prone to worry, they're fairly neurotic, like you said, have a hard time making a choice or have a hard time taking action because their mind is very busy thinking about all the ways things might go wrong. And they might be preoccupied with doing things right, with eliminating the possibility of failure or eliminating the possibility of criticism or judgment. And so they quote unquote overthink an action because they're scared, right? There's this under sort of this substrate of fear and threat.
Yeah. And that's a good point. I think it gets at the core. Like if we were to look at this from a spiritual perspective, let's say, what is at the root of this? Why does it spin out of control? And there's some pain we're afraid of or some suffering. And I really think at the core of it is this fear of separation, loss. Like, if we have a perspective that's an egoic one, we're really vulnerable to all these forces at play of impermanence in the universe. Like things always change, people come and go, everyone dies eventually, and those are scary, painful things. And we have this, like we've been talking about lately, this machinery that can go haywire sometimes and show up as rumination, really excess overthinking, generalized anxiety disorder, some kind of neuroticism, if you will.
OCD or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what you're pointing to are sort of the existential truths that every conscious human has to grapple with. Loss is one, separation. We come into this world alone, we leave it alone, ultimately. The old existentialists would talk about a lot of our psychopathology coming out of these fundamental fears. And loss and separation, as you said, or as you implied, could also boil down to ultimately our own, like our own obliteration, whether it's death or being completely isolated or alone. So when we're in resistance to those existential truths, it creates worry, it can create overthinking and preoccupation, rumination.
So maybe we look at fear for a moment as one of those common types of overthinking that we can all get caught up in. Like, what does one do about fear? Because out there, you're going to get a lot of different advice of like everything from like just destroying your fear to like, honoring it and inviting it for tea.
Yeah. Well, I think we should probably say that fear is not necessarily by definition a maladaptive emotion. And in fact, by definition, it's probably adaptive.
Have it for a reason.
It's important that we feel fear because it's an emotion that's sending us a message. We've often talked about the nature of emotions being message-like, signal-like. And so if I wasn't afraid of anything, I probably wouldn't live for very long.
Yeah.
But overthinking can exacerbate fear. And we can attribute threat to stimuli that aren't necessarily threatening. That happens a lot in, post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. There is a quote on fear, though, that I like as food for thought, not necessarily because I believe everything that is said. I'm going to look it up on my phone here. It comes from Dune, the book, and recently the movie Dune. So this is the little incantation that I think the Bene Gesserit sort of say regarding fear. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. So
I like it.
Sensational and from a novel, a sci-fi novel, but
Dune's cool.
Yeah, Dune's cool. But fear being the little death, and I think, as I reflect on that quote and given what I just said about the importance of fear, it might be that maladaptive fear is the mind killer. And that by having courage, bravery in the face of fear, then, that's that inflection point where we can grow a whole lot. I think of the ways that I've grown the most in my life have been because I've chosen to lean in when I felt afraid.
Yeah. So it's not about not having it clearly.
It's not about being fearless.
Yeah, it's about your relationship with it. And if we were to, we're in territory that I'll admit I can't prove. There are two kind of buckets of wisdom that I draw from in life. Those with scientific studies to back them, and those without. That's more like the age-old wisdom, the things you have to practice. And a lot of this, you just have to try on for size. Like, especially when we're getting into areas that are hard to pinpoint, like consciousness, awareness. But this stuff, like if we see our fear as stemming from that egoic place of fear of separation, loss, pains of all sorts, then if you can slip back into that place of equanimity, and have a relationship with your fear from that place, then I think you're not identified with it. You're not necessarily crippled by it. You can listen to it, get the message, and decide how you respond. Fight, flight, retreat, laugh at it, say it in a cartoon voice, whatever.
Yeah, it gives you choice, like we were saying before. I wonder if it would be helpful to define equanimity. I know we've used that word a lot on the podcast for people who aren't necessarily familiar with that word. What do we mean when we say someone's being equanimous or they have equanimity? Yeah,
it's a fun exercise because you can look at it in a few ways. Like, I think a part of it is like a cognitive flexibility. A part of it is acceptance of how things are, but and a big part is that de-identification with something, like being able to hold your fear and your higher self's kind of observation of, meaning of that, and desired actions around it. I don't know. How would you describe it?
Well, when I think of equanimity, I picture it sort of this person sitting still in a storm. And, sometimes I like to think of the story of Ulysses or Odysseus and tying himself to the mast. I may have shared this on the podcast before, but, he's sailing by the sirens. And if you listen to their song, then you will inevitably steer your ship to their island, crash, and they will devour you. So he asks his crew to plug their ears with wax or something and then tie him to the mast because he wants to listen to this song. I might be getting the story wrong, but this is what I remember from high school.
Oh, yeah.
At least. So, not that it's not a perfect analogy, but I picture, you're listening to all the siren's calls, and that might be analogous to your own thinking patterns that tend to lure you into dangerous waters. But you're equanimous. You're staying fast to the mast, and you're able to stay steady, even though you're still listening, right? You still have the thoughts. They still erupt into your consciousness. Because of the attitude of equanimity, I'm hearing the thoughts, I'm noticing the sensations, I'm feeling the feelings, but I have choice here. You can maintain some level of alignment with what you call sort of the higher self or connection to source, or, your best self, pick your construct, and you're able to navigate those waters successfully.
Yeah.
I mixed a lot of metaphors, but
cool.
Yeah.
And I've shared this before on here, I'm certain, but some things are just worth repeating over and over to myself until I get it. But we're talking about mindfulness as an antidote to overthinking, perhaps. And we were talking a little bit about what is mindfulness, like what does that really mean? And one framework I like would be looking at the pillars of it. Like, mindfulness is paying attention, right? Mindfulness is kind of tuning into your senses. There's another pillar, but mindfulness is equanimity. You need that part of it. So you can, here's another analogy. Like, say there's a choppy surface of water. You can't see through it until you let it settle. And then you could focus your attention, tune into it, but you need that equanimity to see through the choppy surface. It's what calms the waters. It's what clears that space in your mental chatter, if you will, along with these other things. It's not enough to just be equanimous and do nothing about it, right? a puddle of equanimity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not trying to become a puddle of equanimity. Some of the tools, like I referenced earlier from ACT and IFS in particular, have been helpful for me and some of my clients in practicing mindfulness in this way. I struggled with what probably would have been diagnosed with OCD when I was younger. Thankfully, I just have some of those neurotic traits now. It's not a full-blown disorder. But the idea that my thoughts were coming from a part of me and not all of me helped me create some of that distance and maintain equanimity. So I'd have an intrusive obsession, and instead of immediately getting wrapped around the axle about that thought and needing to do something to make myself feel better, the compulsion, the accompanying compulsion, I could think of it as like, oh, that's my OCD mind. That's the part of my mind that's really, really afraid of all things. And I can simply listen to him and maybe even extend some compassion and understanding to him without fusing with him, without blending with him. Yeah.
And you're talking in some IFS terms, which I think it can be quite useful. It's just reminding me that everyone needs to find their own tools, like bag of tools and tricks to flip to get you out of overthinking. What's the pattern interrupter for you? Is it a question or a realization or a remembering of, oh, that's a part of me, maybe a wounded part from long ago that experienced some pain, and let's have some compassion and understanding. Of course, it grabbed the mic from me and was yelling all this mental chatter of don't go in that door. But then you can have that dialogue of, oh, I got us. It's a new era now. And, you can join me on this new adventure, my child, as we forge ahead. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think the IFS tool set was particularly helpful for me because it appealed to the part of my mind that wanted explanations. It wasn't enough for me to just say, well, that's just sort of my mind glitching, because what if I'm wrong, right? I had the particular brand of OCD that was like about scrupulosity and making sure everything was right and perfect and pure. Yeah. And so attributing those thoughts to just sort of like, oh, that's just part of your brain freaking out wasn't enough for me. But then, like you described, being able to attribute those thoughts to a part of me that had an origin story, like that had good reasons for developing the coping strategies that perhaps served me at one point in my life, but no longer serve me. It enabled me to have some self-compassion where self-compassion was a struggle before. So being able to tell myself the story, oh, like that particularly perturbing thought that you're having, that comes from a time in your life when you really wanted to be, like loved and appreciated, and you felt like you had to be perfect in order to get it. So your capital S self, your more mature self, knows that that's not necessary anymore, but it hasn't eliminated that part of you. So just that concept helped me create the distance that was durable, that I could actually believe and buy into.
Yeah, people say that IFS is a rather efficient kind of therapy. Like you can get to kind of the good stuff rather efficiently, and I think that's one of the reasons why is it does kind of mitigate or avoid some of these tangents in the labyrinth of our own mind of wanting to know, like overthinking about like where this comes from, like you're saying, to give one example. But it does bring it in kind of a somewhat holistic framework, or one that cuts to the heart of it.
Other tools that have helped me are thinking about my worries, and these help plenty of my clients, in terms of productive versus unproductive worry. And, something could be said about the word productive, but I think at least for this example, if what I'm thinking about, what I'm sort of stuck on, what I'm future tripping about, or whatever it is it about things that I have control over, right? Is this about things that I could actually take action and resolve, or, spare myself from? If the answer is no, right? If I'm worried about like, well, what if while I'm driving the day, I get hit by another motorist? Well, you could not drive, right? You could stay in your house for the rest of your life. You could drive carefully. You could also embrace the possibility that it might happen and that it is unlikely to happen. But what do I have control over? I have control over whether or not I drive. I have control over where I drive and how I drive. And so I'm going to focus on the things that I have control over. That would be maybe considered quote unquote productive worry if it leads to values consistent, reasonable action.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the advice sometimes people give of setting aside a worry time?
I've recommended that to clients for whom that has been really helpful. Because if worry is a habit, not unlike, I don't know, let's say you're trying to get a handle on an unhealthy relationship to a particular substance or something like that. And it just shows up impulsively, spontaneously, maybe in response to some cues. You can say, all right, I'm only going to worry during this 30 minutes of the day. So the part of me that wants to worry, I can appease it. I don't have to say, no, I'm not worrying anymore, because then it's going to come back with vengeance. And our minds don't react well to suppression, right? Or resistance, like you said before. So I'm going to schedule some worry time. And it is during this time, I'm just going to go all out. And I'm going to worry like crazy, worry myself tired. And then when the timer beeps, I'm done. And if I feel like I wanted to worry more, I can tell my mind, you'll have a chance to worry more. You can do it tomorrow at 6:30 or whenever your worry time is. It doesn't work for everybody, but it's worked for some.
Yeah, and I've found it especially useful when it is practiced. If you do an exercise as well that you mentioned or alluded to, is like dividing your worries up into categories of things you can control and things you can't. Mm-hmm. I think we talked about this practice in an episode a while back on stoicism, one of the precepts. But I'm wondering in your practices, like you can think about what to do with the things you can control. Like you could brainstorm solutions, but what do you do with the worries about things you can't control?
Yeah, that's tougher. I think we mentioned the tool of IFS. That's helped me just think of that I have a part that worries about things that I can't control. And that when I indulge that part too much, or that part, like we said before, gets the steering wheel, it's not very helpful. So I start to think about the worries about things I can't control in sort of a pragmatic sense. Does allowing myself to spin out on these particular worries improve my life or make my life worse? Usually the answer to that is it makes it worse. So I'm taking a utilitarian approach to my mind. Sure, I'll give my mind some time to worry about those things. And then the things I can't control, I'm going to let go and let God, right? I'm going to sort of offer it up to the fates and try to focus instead on living the life that I want to cultivate.
Yeah, it seems like through various spiritual traditions, there are different rituals or stories, if you will, about letting go, or like burn it all away. Like in Hinduism, there's this Kali goddess of like, or the refiner's fire, if you will. But I think whatever it is, like I've done these burning bowl ceremonies, often at New Year's with meditation groups where, we'll write things to let go of and ceremonially light them on fire. Or I've done that with my kids at the end of a semester or something, even with their homework. But I think anything you can do to kind of ceremonialize, sacramentalize, if you will, the discomfort through some practice like that can help, or visualize things drifting away. There are a million different approaches. And again, I think it's a practice of it's why we like to talk about these things, why we get in community and learn from each other and try on different approaches. Yeah.
And one thing's not going to work for everybody. Like you said earlier, everybody needs to sort of pick up the bag of tools that works best for them. One that I recommend to people very judiciously, this one's not for everybody, is optimistic nihilism or absurdism. So the idea is that, if I'm really, really fretting about things that I can't control, and there's a part of me that just needs control over those things for whatever reason, I might sort of project my mind forward and be like, okay, in 100 years, I'm going to be gone. In another 50 years, everyone who knows me basically is going to be gone. And in another 50 years, basically everything that had anything to do with me, there might be ripples, is going to be dust. And, you project forward several million or billion years, this entire planet is likely to be dust. And so, why worry about the small things? With the short blink of time that I have as an incarnated soul on this planet, I want to make the best of it. So sometimes that little bit of perspective can help. And I say I recommend this with caution, because nihilism in and of itself can be a quick path to misery. But that's why I add that term optimistic. There's a whole branch of philosophy about absurdism and optimistic nihilism.
And I like those. They're quite fun. But you do need a certain level of equanimity in your equanimity bucket to be able to contemplate those fun nihilistic ideas.
Yeah. One that's related but not particularly nihilistic is just perspective granting activities. Certainly the name of this podcast is Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. The psychedelics can often grant people perspectives that help with overthinking, for sure. But I remember one time when I was a teen and was sort of stuck in an overthinking loop. And my brother showed me this video that was sort of a Google Earth view of like my neighborhood. And then it would zoom out to the country and zoom out to the planet. And then it zoomed all the way out past the solar system, the galaxy. And it was, you are this tiny speck on this world. Your life and your actions are significant to you, and they should be. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, whether or not you have a peanut butter and jelly or a peanut butter and honey sandwich is really not a big deal.
Yeah. Perspective's a good way to look at it, I think. And whatever gets you there, like I find myself most days retreating to either and this is like most days, this happens many times, like my meditation cushion, my yoga mat, a mindful walk, or some breathing practice, even if I'm in a crowded meeting room or whatever, because anything that returns me to my center when I've been pulled off into the past, the future, or the dark corners of my mind, like whatever that is. And to bring it back to the IFS framework, perspective was one of those 5 Ps we were talking about last time, that go along with the 8 Cs of like that calm and confident connectedness. And so I think what we're talking about is, anything that gets you back in that place of perspective, of clarity, if you will, is a good antidote for overthinking. And you got to find those little flips that work for you.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most inspiring characters for me that sort of demonstrates what we're talking about is Viktor Frankl.
Oh, yeah.
The Austrian psychiatrist who was in the concentration camps, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. I wrote down one of his quotes here. Everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given circumstances, to choose one's own way. So another way of thinking about that is choosing where to focus. So like we're talking about perspective, you can focus on all the crappy things that are happening. They might be very real, by the way, right? We're not just talking about fooling yourself into worrying or overthinking. You could be dealing with a lot of gnarly stuff. And so, who on the planet was dealing with more gnarly stuff than somebody in a concentration camp, right? And one of the observations he made was that in the midst of all this suffering and this oppression and this exploitation and this torture and murder, he noticed that the people who at least tried to hang on to their humanity by helping others, by serving others, by making love, like doing all those things, were the ones that were able to make it, apart from the ones who were like obviously overtly murdered. But and he came up with his logotherapy and about narratives and where you focus as a result. Pretty inspiring.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's one of my favorite books. But it does highlight something, like we're all on this spectrum of neuroticism, if you will, somewhere, based on our genetic deck of cards that we were dealt and all of our life experiences and how those led to other life experiences and how we at that point were shaped by the next ones. But then he has this like potent example of someone who's able to, acknowledge those fears, like go to those places and sit with them, but come back to that attitude, those joys, those little joys in life, where that's a hard thing to do. Yeah. And that's the practice.
And it was a practice, right? It's not like Frankl was just this equanimous Buddha through the entire experience. He grieved, he lamented, he was angry, he resisted, all those things. But through all those things, he found his way to these really, really important insights. And maybe just to double down on what I was saying earlier about, some very real gnarly stuff can be happening in one's life.
Yep.
This episode about you not being your thoughts, about don't believe everything you think. We're not trying to imply that happiness is simply an inside job, and that if you find yourself suffering, it's because you're not navigating your thoughts well enough. Sometimes we are suffering and we're depressed and we're traumatized because the systems in which we live, in which we operate, the relationships which we have, the ways in which we've been oppressed or victimized are just really, really terrible. And I think sometimes people buy in too much to this idea that if I were only able to control my thoughts, then I would not experience any kind of negative emotion, can be really perilous. And you see it in the sort of spiritual bypassing of the spiritualist community or the spiritual materialism, where, if you're experiencing any kind of anger or frustration, it's because, I don't know, your freaking chakras aren't aligned or your light codes aren't accurate or whatever it is. So I just wanted to sort of name that just so people don't get too discouraged or annoyed.
Yeah. Everyone struggles with overthinking. Everyone is on this beautiful spectrum somewhere, and maybe it's part of our curriculum, if you will, in our unique way of maybe it's a doorway we all have to figure out how to go through, and to be wired like this as humans and still exist in the world and still find peace and joy.
Yeah. And there's no shame in that, right? Like one of IFS's C's is compassion. And there probably is, nary an episode that goes by that we don't mention compassion, particularly self-compassion. But if it's your curriculum, the way you're wired, then it's nothing to be angry at yourself about or the world about. It simply is. I think about that sometimes, the way we're wired, and as it relates to personality traits like neuroticism, the deck of genetic cards, the hand of genetic cards that we've been given. So we all vary on a variety of spectrums, on a variety of continua, and there's some mobility on those spectrums and continua. But I think there is something to be gained by sort of accepting some things about you and having compassion.
Yeah, maybe we should define neuroticism just for fun, because it is one of those big 5 personality traits. And in fact, I have I think the world's shortest screener of the big 5 personality traits right here.
Is it the Neo or a shortened version of the Neo?
This is a short one with just 2 questions per big 5. And the 2 questions on neuroticism are, I'm easily stressed and worry about things. I'm easily upset and prone to mood swings. But it's, essentially a personality trait representing the degree to which a person experiences things in the world as distressing, uncomfortable, threatening, unsafe, if you will. And then along with that can come that emotional lability.
Right. Yeah. How perturbable are you? And then how prone are you to fixating on, the result of that perturbation?
Yeah. Because if people low naturally on the neuroticism scale would be, less prone to worry about the little things or sweat the small stuff. But, someone with a high level of neuroticism at a certain point in their life would be more concerned by a physical symptom that shows up or a mishap in life.
Right.
Yeah.
And we were talking about sort of some of the things that contribute to personality traits like this. Now there's movement on that spectrum, but you can imagine somebody who comes into the world with a nervous system that is a little bit more sensitive than the average nervous system.
Yeah.
That they actually experience stimuli more intensely than the average person. I think about my own kids. I may have shared this example before, but each child came into the world and I could already tell that I started with the second child, wow, he's different from his brother. His startle response is way more intense than his brother's, more sensitive to touch. Don't you dare tickle that child. Because it causes discomfort for him, whereas my other child was all for it. And so you can imagine a nervous system that is actually feeling the world and it's turned up to 11, whereas maybe the average is at 5, might develop a little bit more neuroticism, right? More sensitive to their environment.
A blessing and a curse. We may have mentioned it here before, but I use this concept a lot when working with families and certain mental health struggles like eating disorders, for example, or there's this highly sensitive child scale.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's one kind of physician researcher in this space who talks about the orchid child. Like that way of looking at it at least highlights the two sides of the coin. It can be a blessing and a curse to have that level of sensitivity. Like this would be someone who can really tune into the world and themselves, like really feel things deeply. But without that equipoise or the ability to kind of flex with the tides and things, then it could be overwhelming.
Yeah, and the orchid doesn't survive without the right sort of conditions and care.
Yeah.
And contrasted to what? Dandelion children, I think, was
that would
the
be
other example. And it grows wherever it is.
Yeah, like growing through the cracks in concrete.
Mm-hmm.
And, I want to put the compassionate disclaimer that we're not saying that orchids are beautiful and dandelions aren't.
Right. Right.
It's just, we come into this world with our uniqueness for sure. And then it's further shaped by the world. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm tempted to ask, any other thoughts about thoughts?
Oh.
Any other thinking about thinking? You mentioned our episode on stoicism. I've got a few quotes here from Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah, let's have a quote battle.
Yeah.
I'll give you a yoga quote in response to your stoic quote.
The battle of the ancient wisdom traditions.
See what happens.
So, and there are a variety of translations of these, but these are some of the ones I found. So Marcus Aurelius, the happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. That's not something to get too obsessive about, ironically. And then another is, do not indulge in dreams of having what you have not. This is one about sort of focus and gratitude. But reckon up the chief of the blessings you do possess, and then thankfully remember how you would crave for them if they were not yours. Gratitude for what you have can cure the endless desire for what you have not. So, this is a particular kind of self-torture when we compare ourselves to others, or when we envy others. We are obsessively focused on what we lack, and that distracts us from appreciating what we have. We've talked many times about sort of the magic of gratitude. And if any of you have ever been to therapy, or you read a freaking BuzzFeed article or asked ChatGPT on what do I do about my mental health, you'll likely to have read, make a gratitude list, count your blessings. Mm-hmm. It's been recommended so much, it's almost been drained of meaning, but there's lots of really good social science research to suggest that when we do orient ourselves toward gratitude, our sense of well-being increases.
Yeah, because it's not about chasing happiness, right? Mm-hmm. Or chasing a happy ideal, but more about a path of contentment. And it is a path because it takes a hell of a lot of time and effort and practice to get to that place of being completely at ease in one's mind with thoughts, body, and spirit in whatever situation you find yourself in life, whether you're waking up to the sound of chirping birds and ocean waves and a cool breeze on vacation, or whether you're waking up to the garbage truck and a crying baby and your alarm at the same time, right?
Yeah. It's a testament to the power of focus, and I found myself doing this the other day where, I was feeling kind of grumpy. I was focusing more on what I didn't have, was able to catch myself, and I just started walking around my house. Like, this might sound a little odd, but thanking all the things about my home that I am so grateful for,
cool.
that I take for granted. Like, so grateful that this house has indoor plumbing. I'm so grateful that the air conditioner works. Yeah. I'm so grateful that I have a refrigerator. So grateful that I have a basement that I can go down to and be nice and cool and cozy. And it's sort of another iteration of this. The weather was really bad outside, and I found myself sort of lamenting the wind and the cold. And then I was able to pivot and be like, man, I'm so grateful I have walls and windows to protect me from the elements.
Yeah.
And that little shift of focus, not necessarily controlling my thoughts, certainly was aware of my negative thoughts, but transitioning my focus to the things I was grateful for made all the difference.
Transitioning them, like your next step. It's not like eradicate the thoughts into oblivion. It's like deciding in this mindful state, when you can decide in the here and now, what your next step is. And your next step was, one of those practices, one of those countless practices like we're talking about that gives you that little flip back into perspective. And it's reminded me of like when you talk about enlightenment as a spiritual concept, I view it as, these little moments of enlightenment that we can tap into throughout the day and want to more and more. But some would define enlightenment as a radical change in perspective. So gratitude being one way of flipping things like, I'm glad garbage trucks come and pick up my trash. That's
right.
Luxury.
It's totally a luxury. It's a miracle of modern society that all these complicated apes could get together and make garbage trucks run on time.
Oh yeah, and I can control earplugs or whatever it is.
Exactly.
Yeah, but yeah, that's where practices and perspective come into play.
Yeah. All right, let's hear your yoga quote.
Oh yeah, I forgot. This is about integration, but I have a suspicion that this yogi, his name's BKS Iyengar. He passed away within the past decade or so. I have a suspicion that he doesn't even know what psychedelics are, if you were to ask him. But he said, integration from the outermost layer to the innermost self. We integrate, we don't banish thoughts or repress memories or emotions. Rather, we free ourselves from the turmoil that they, which in yoga speak you'd call vrittis or mind chatter, that they cause by training the mind to observe, discern, and detach through asana, pranayama, meditation. So yoga, breathing, meditating, sitting with these thoughts instead of banishing or repressing.
Observe. What was the second?
Discern and
detach.
Through yoga.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yoga meaning union of mind, body, and spirit, if you want to add that in.
Yeah, I love it.
Because if you look at like one of the most commonly talked about yoga texts in the Western world that we draw from anyway is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And it's like this 2,000-year-old book of roughly 100 sutras or stitches or threads of wisdom. And one of them, like number 1.2, is this most commonly used definition of yoga that is, in Sanskrit, it's like yoga chitta vritti nirodha. So yoga is the settling of the mind into silence, or yoga is the settling of the mental chatter, not gone, but like that waves of a surface analogy, so you can see more clearly, and done by tuning into something in the here and now, like your gratitude emotion, your breath, your your body.
Yeah. It's beautiful, and it makes me think again of the promise of psychedelic-assisted therapy to help people who are sort of beset by their mind chatter. Yeah. Because certainly some of our clients have experienced, and I've experienced with my own psychedelic journeys, the sort of settling of those waves and the granting of perspective. Mm-hmm. I remember an early psychedelic experience that I had where it was like an embodied, really, really present moment embodied experience of the nature of thought. And that I could just see the origin story of all these thoughts. And if you've ever seen that movie Minority Report, with
that's cool.
What's his face?
I can
Tom
picture
Cruise.
it. Yeah.
He's got all the screens and he's sort of just flipping screens, to and fro. And that was my experience of my thoughts. Like I'd have this thought, like, that thought is connected
thought
to
ninja.
This old, like Fruit Ninja, right? That thought is connected to this old wound or this old desire. And I don't really need that. I actually don't need to let it stick. And I can kind of just flick it away. And then all of a sudden a new one would erupt, and it's this urge, this preference, and I could just sort of see it for what it was and flick it away.
Yeah.
And, I understood that concept before I ever tried psychedelics from sort of an intellectual place, but actually living it and feeling it and being able to play with it was an entirely new experience that really changed me for the rest of my life. It became this touchstone that I could return to.
And just to, I know you're kind of answering this already, but why is that? Why do you get it in a life-changing way from that mystical experience and not from the Netflix thing you watched about it?
Yeah. I mean, it's actually a really good question, the why, because we could go down the sort of neurological rabbit trail of what is a psychedelic doing in your brain that allows for psychological flexibility and presence. We go down the spiritual rabbit trail of, detaching from all the suffering that I was creating by myself and feeling that this was granted to me by the universe, by my higher self, by source or whatever. But I guess as I reflect in real time about that particular experience, it was just being able to experience that phenomenon without doubt. Like it was a sort of direct experience.
Feel it in your body.
Yeah. I think that's what helped it feel direct as opposed to sort of just, what would be the right word?
Like reading someone's experience in a book.
Yeah. So I think
because you got to have a fully embodied with all your senses on board, weird experience.
Weird.
Mystical, like non-ordinary. So it could show you the way or blow the door off your previously self-limited concept of reality. Yeah.
There's a name for this, and I forget what it is, but it's this notion that, sometimes in psychedelic experience, what we experience feels truer than true. Like it feels realer than our real lives.
Yeah.
And so I think that experience sort of impressed upon me the utility and truthiness of this particular experience.
Truthiness, I like it.
That helped me believe it.
Rick Strassman would be proud. He talked about that when we had him on this show, talking about how that was one of the more common descriptions of a DMT experience, or one of the common things he heard from it was that it just felt truer than true.
Which is an integration challenge, just as an aside, for some folks as they come back to regular consciousness.
But you do return with gifts in general, with all the caveats around you got to be ready, you got to have support, you got to integrate a shit ton before you go back there, all that. And you can bring some of that embodied kind of mystical wisdom that you've received from wherever, like your inner healer, from the universe, however you want to look at it. You can bring it back and weave it into day-to-day life if you do that practice. Yeah.
Right. Well, as is customary for an episode of Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, where it's just you and me, Reid, we've talked about a lot of different things today. Gone down many rabbit trails. Is there anything else about thoughts and not being your thoughts?
There's everything else,
Infinite, right?
But I think that feels like a good stopping point.
Good place to stop. Thank you for your attention, everybody. Until next time.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.